I'm delighted to welcome you today to one of the more inspiring events that have taken place in this country and its museums. It is MAP, which has not only opened its doors as a museum, but it also is the first one in the digital space in this country and perhaps one of the first ones in the rest of the world. The reason why we are celebrating this event is because it is going to make a big change in India, is going to contribute to its student body, is going to contribute to our understanding of crafts and our cultural heritage. The first part of this is what I'm introducing, and we're going to open with textile, craft, and design today. When I was a student in America, I was studying history of art. This was in the 60s, and when I was studying that, I was trying to find some sort of connect with what is happening in India on the art forum. And not strangely, but there was no contact. At that point of time, we were given no education in art history, leave alone the arts and textiles or crafts of this country. When I came back to India, I, by sheer accident, got into doing revival work in the heart of Bengal, where at one time, due to patronage by the Nawabs, the embroidery craft was there at one time, alive and kicking, but 200 years of colonial rule had completely killed it. As it had killed the hand weaving, the printing, the embroideries, and almost any kind of pottery or clay making, which was done by hand in the 200 years that they were here. There was a man called Watson, and he was given the task by the British to try and copy he couldn't copy the skills, but try and copy all the designs that you can find in India of any discipline and make a documentary of that so that they could take all the designs to Manchester. And they put up huge mills in Lancashire where they imported Indian cotton, and they tried to reinvent the booties from Jaipur, the chins from Machilipatnam, the jamavas from Kashmir. As a matter of fact, there's a town called Paisley in Scotland, which they named after that particular motif. And India, from being a country which was doing about 50% of its GDP in exports to the rest of the world, became the country which had 2% GDP left. The rest of it was coming by everybody copying Indian designs and sending them back to India to sell to us. Now, as a student, and I would imagine even today as a student, if I wanted to go and look for printing, embroidery, any kind of traditional discipline that we had in the country, there was nowhere. As a matter of fact, even today, there is nowhere except for the Calico Museum in Ahmedabad, maybe, and also the rest of the government museums. All their collections are sitting in archives, in trunks, and in Godrej cupboards in the basements. Now, as a student of Indian textiles, I found it very demoralizing to fly to England, to the Victoria and Albert Museum, to locate Indian fabrics and designs, and then to France, as well as to Amsterdam, to locate what we had as a treasure of our country. Now, MAP, if it is doing this digital space, is going to provide one of the first and only facilities for anybody or any student to get conversant with our own history. Now, those huge archives that Mr. Watson had are lying in the zoo in Bombay as an archive, and in the Kew Garden in London. So if we have to look for what we did beautifully in weaves, you can't go to today's weaver because most weavers, most craftspeople cannot afford to keep one piece of their own of excellence because they're not rich enough to do that, to hold those in their archives. It then becomes the responsibility of somebody like MAP to step in this area, which is vital for us to revive our heritage, to be able to be conversant with what we are doing. Now, I'm in the fashion business. Fashion in India is so different to fashion anywhere else in the world. Anywhere else in the world, they tell you yellow is the season next season and that you wear yellow. For some reason, fortunately, India is the only country which is not following this regiment. And that, I think, we are fortunate because we have a huge lot of crafts in this country on which the entire fashion industry and the big fat Indian wedding depends upon. Whether it's in embroideries or prints or weaving, we are not wearing white gowns, we are wearing something that comes from our own ethos. That's the reason I wrote that book, Textiles and Costumes of Royal India, because I thought we needed reference points. And I think we need further reference points. We have just about started the journey. And as a revival effort, I congratulate MAP for doing what they are doing. And I hope the archives will be open to a lot of people who need this as education. Thank you.
We would like to thank Ritu Kumar for introducing our textiles, craft and design segment. I will be discussing 8 highlights from MAP's collection. All the artworks are at the intersection of craft and design. So it is one of the only classifications where art is sentimental while also serving as a functional object. Their beauty lies in how they were made, used and probably reused by many people. Although most of the objects were made in the 19th and the 20th century, their craft originated thousands of years ago. Included next to these beautifully designed objects are embroidered, woven and painted textiles. Each of these artworks play a significant role in reviving crafts of India and Southeast Asia. Objects as artworks went beyond how art is traditionally perceived. We could touch it and it survived after many uses. Found at home, probably in the kitchen, these objects like lacquered vessels that you see here were auspicious for the family who owned them. They could hold vermilion, which is kumkum, turmeric or spices in them. So as they often contained in them elements that were used to decorate idols of worship, the routine of taking care of them was especially very important. Lacquered wooden vessels were one of the oldest crafts to be practiced in India, with its reference dating back to Ain Akbari. This craft was practiced in many regions of India, and South India particularly was known for the quality of wood and the application of lacquer, as we can see here. Scholars state that wooden vessels were one of the most important design objects in India. Interiors of a simple Hindu household were not fashioned with wall paintings and upholstery. Instead, their simplicity and beauty lay in crafted vessels like these. Given their size, colors and patterns, they almost resemble a spin top that younger children often play with. Like wooden vessels in the previous highlight, the craft of making pith from the shola plant stem also serves a functional purpose. Used to make headgears for bridegroom, dolls, garlands and idols for worship, this lightweight shola stem was adapted by artisans in many ways, particularly in the late 20th century. This sculpture is interesting not only because it is carved out of a natural and a sustainable material, but also because the carving of this man and women is so realistic. Focus on the drapes of her sari and the creases of his pants. These details are so difficult to achieve. The woman wears a nose ring or a nath indicating that she is married, while the man holds the swords. They slightly look towards each other, almost like a high-definition photograph. Shola pith is an art form which is also practiced majorly in Tamil Nadu and Bengal. This is because shola pith is made from shola that grows in wild mushy areas. The farmer's dedication in taking care of the plant for it to reach the right height helps the artisan to carve it perfectly. While the use of shola pith was reserved for religious purposes, it was only in the late 20th century when the craft was accessible to everyone. We've seen that craft can serve many purposes. However, Bidri ware pushes these boundaries of beauty and functionality. From Bidar in present-day Karnataka, Bidri ware became extremely popular in international exhibitions in the 19th century, with objects serving as trays, plates, jewelry boxes, and even jewelry. This water pipe or hookah base is made in a Bidri style of inlaying metal on silver. Look at the symmetry of floral and abstract patterns. It reflects the artisan's precision in creating this silver-black contrast. Some designs also narrate folk and mythical tales which are often hidden inside the jar or etched at the base of a plate. We can also see hookahs being smoked by nobility in paintings of Deccani and northern regions of India. As you can see here in this painting from Mewar, the Bidri hookah adds to the noble status of the man depicted. Map's collection is a testament to the objects which served as one of the earliest examples of smelting from India. Designed as early as the Deccani rule, Bidri ware has a geographical indication from the Government of India. Creating this black coating to add its magnificent silver includes many processes from smoothing to carving. This craft is not just about the lost traditions but also provides our designers with tools for innovation. The artisan is excellent at the chemical processes that makes the metal and at etching these intricate designs. In 2019, many articles were published raising concerns about how Karnataka is losing this tradition, and to me, including this in the highlights is an important step. Similar to wooden, shola pith and metal objects are textiles which change their purpose over time. Here, we have a patola cloth woven in Gujarat but for the Indonesian market, probably in the 19th century. Patolas originated in Patan, Gujarat and were woven by the Salvi community. The threads, warp and weft on the cloth are tied and tied before weaving, and this process is called double ikat and takes weeks to achieve. If we look closely, we can see the tiger and elephant or Vagh Hathi pattern that symbolizes warfare and ceremonial worship. Although patola technique originated in Gujarat, it quickly became popular in Indonesia because of the Indian subcontinent spice and cloth trade. Patolas, which were woven as saris for women, were then specifically designed for the Indonesian market as ceremonial or shoulder cloths for nobility. Like the patola cloth in the previous highlight, this chintz textile was also traded between India and the world. Trade textiles like chintz and palampors were produced in the northwestern and southeastern part of India, formerly Coromandel Coast, for the European, Indonesian and Central Asian markets from the 17th to 19th century. If we look closely at the many motifs, we can see the sacred flower with 8 petals, various species of pheasants like peacocks, tree of life patterns and flowers that resemble East Asian motifs. This textile was probably used as a wall hanging or even a bedsheet. The red background, which has retained its color over centuries, is painstakingly achieved by the dyers after several processes. The underlying technique of applying dyes on this fabric comes from kalamkari in India and was practiced using natural elements like madder and indigo. I find this particular chintz pattern to be interesting because we see this being adopted by fashion brands consistently. It highlights this complex relationship between authenticity and appropriation that are being discussed today. Most Indian textiles didn't have a stamp or an inscription of the maker because the textiles were meant to stay in the family. However, now that it enters a museum space as a craft form, I would like to highlight these 2 specific examples, a chop fulkari and a kantha with the inscription of its female makers. Traditionally practiced in the household and made by one or many women, each stitch, material and color holds a special significance. In Punjab, chop fulkari shawl was worn as a head cover by the bride on her wedding day. Look closely on the bright red khadar and you see little pink stitches made in the center. These stitches might have been made by the bride's mother, grandmother and aunt as a legacy for the bride to take into her new life. Women in Bengal express and shape their personal identity by embroidering on rags of cloth or kantha. Every kantha is converted into an accessory which further becomes a keeper of women's secrets. Kantha as an art form is special because women sit together and communicate with each other by perfecting this Kantha stitch. They complete each other's doodles, plan symmetrical flowers, and openly depict their hopes and fears on a cloth. Kantha is powerful. Every motif, stitch, colors of the thread, and technique has meaning. Notable art historian Stella Kramrisch observes that the 8-petal blooming flowers in a Kantha has an entire universe contained in it. This Kantha quilt is immensely creative. See how the maker, Bhomik, combines angels wearing saris, women grooming themselves in this Kalighat style, and lions resembling coats of arms. In spite of all the innovative elements, the artist retains the central flower and the paisleys in the corner. We saw that the embroidered fulkari and Kantha were made by women. Craft was considered to have a gender divide in which delicate crafts were practiced by women in the household. However, Chamba or Pahari Rumal is one of the exceptions. Originating from the mountain or Pahari regions of India, Rumal literally means a kerchief. It is embroidered on both sides of the cloth, and the stylistic features were associated with popular Indian painting traditions of North India. It is used for many purposes. It contains social meanings and yet is often overlooked as a key accessory. Often found in square and rectangular unbleached cotton with embroidered, naturally dyed silk threads, Pahari Rumals were collected and passed down across generations. These vibrant kerchiefs were auspicious and are depicted in drawings in which women hold a plate with the covering of Pahari Rumal. We see scenes of Hindu god Krishna's power, love, and devotion to dance, worship, and music in these kerchiefs. Scenes of Krishna's daily activities are fascinating to spot in textiles because they provide a context of how people express their identities. The musical performance by the Rajiv Raja Combine is an original composition by the band called An Ode to Krishna. It explores various rasas such as playfulness, beauty, adoration, and celebration. A classical yet contemporary tribute to one of the most beloved gods that responds to a selection of pitchwise from the Maps collection.
Art at its most basic level is a form of self-expression. But at a deeper level, it is the expression of an artist's soul, an expression of all that is beyond definition, of the sublime, of spiritualism, of love, of emotion, of a whole hidden world that is brought out for the world to see. And that's the meaning of art to me. How did I respond to the Krishna Pichai paintings? Well, when I looked at them, I saw beauty, I saw devotion, I saw adoration, and also celebration. And when I combined this with my personal memories and feelings for Lord Krishna, I saw the need to express a certain timelessness that he represents, but at the same time, a very contemporary message that is relevant even today. So which is why this composition has elements of classical music and at the same time a very contemporary feel also built into it. And I've called this composition Ode to Krishna.
Linking collections around the world, Museums Without Borders is a unique digital collaboration between MAP and institutions in India and abroad. Each episode in this series juxtaposes an artwork from MAP with an object from a partner museum, exploring commonalities and differences in style, subject, or narrative. In a time of restricted mobility, this initiative helps to build bridges between people, collections, and institutions. On the surface, a Pida chair from Rajasthan and a Rietveld red and blue chair may not have much in common. Yet, this video, in collaboration with Jochen Eisenbrand from the Vitra Design Museum and Divya Thakur on behalf of MAP, will unearth how two chairs from seemingly distinct cultures share structural and compositional similarities, from the emphasis on geometry to the seemingly transparent construction.
We're here today to talk about a subject very close to my heart, which is seating design in India. And we're going to be doing a dialogue between MAP and Vitra, which, as we all know, is an iconic place for seating design. Here we're going to be talking about an iconic form of seating, which is the low seat or the Pida chair. So welcome and come on in. So we're talking about the interpretation of this chair, why this design, why the low seat, why do we have low seating that existed in our country at that time. So really low seating came about as a manner of just giving a person of higher authority reinforcement. So if you were sitting with a group of people, which mostly everybody sat on the floor or a carpet or a qaleen, then you gave a person of nobility or a doctor or a learned man or a priest just an elevated seat, just slightly off the ground, to reinforce his authority. That's really the reason for this structure and this form. And the arcaded back is an exquisite feature here, and you'll see it across chairs at that time, which were, if you think about the throne, that is something that we've all seen. If you look at manuscripts, if you look at miniatures, they all have arcaded backs. I mean, the elevated seat exists just as an elevated seat or a stool. All our sculptures, think about the gods and goddesses across Ajanta, Buddhist carvings, all of it. You'll see elevated seats, the lotus seat, different forms of seating, and the arcaded back in some. So obviously in our chair, the Pida chair, we see a gentle recline, that is for comfort, because an absolute straight, which is a beautiful commonality with the red blue chair. It's almost an identical form of recline, angle of recline. And yes, so that I guess is for comfort and also for perhaps for authority again.
The red-blue chair by Dutch designer and architect Gerrit Rietveld is not your typical armchair. However, it has some of the typical features of an armchair. It has a low seating position, armrests, a high backrest. Still, it is an armchair really stripped to its main structure. It does not have upholstery, no textiles, no skin, no comfort really offered by any type of upholstery. It is a chair that is stripped to its main structure, consisting basically of two elements, slats and boards. 13 slats altogether, 6 of them for the vertical posts, 7 of them for the horizontal rails, and then 2 wider slats for the armrests. In addition to that, 2 boards, 1 for the backrest and 1 for the seat.
So we talk about the production of this chair. So obviously it's a one-off, it is a handcrafted piece, and there are many similar kinds of chairs that exist in this form, and those similarities and differences would occur based on region and on purpose. So if you were creating a Pida chair in Rajasthan, it would be made from wood that was locally sourced from there. And if you were creating a chair in Gujarat, then it would use material that was locally and easily available there. And again, it would be influenced by cultural habits. So if you ate in a particular way or addressed an audience in a particular way, it would be designed as per that. So Jochen, the red blue chair by Rietveld, why do you think he chose this color palette? What is the significance of these very strong colors?
Looking back at the design of the red blue chair in the 1950s, Rietveld stated that he had also been looking at the color theory of Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who was himself inspired by the color theory of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe as an inspiration. Rietveld said that he wanted to create a chair out of the most essential elements in terms of geometric shapes, but also in terms of the essential colors. What do you know about the maker of your chair? Was it made by one person or were there a number of craftsmen involved?
It is more likely that a team of people got together and this is the result of a combined effort. You could see the jali work, the piercing, the woodwork, the jute work. It's a combined effort, as it has always been, and it's really a wonderful way of working. It's something for us to learn from, I think, even today. So Rietveld is the founding member of the Dessier movement. Now, what were the principles of it, and what principles do we see reflected in the chair?
Rietveld's red-blue chair is closely associated with De Stijl, the group founded in 1917 by Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian, a group of painters, architects, and even a poet who were asking for a new art at the end of World War I, asking for a new art that represented a new world order opposite to the one that had created this terrible war and the destruction in its wake. One of the reasons the chair has been associated with De Stijl is the closeness of Rietveld to Theo van Doesburg and the De Stijl group, but most obviously the color scheme, because it corresponds with the color schemes used by the painters of the De Stijl movement.
The chair did exist in many other versions. You have basically a four-legged device is called a charpai, and a three-legged device is called a tipai, and like that you've got the chauki and you've got what we have here, which is a pira, also patla. So depending on the region, you have different names and different purposes. So according to the purpose, the object was altered and adapted to suit its primary purpose. So across Gujarat, Rajasthan, you will find different kinds of woodwork, different kinds of material. They vary just slightly based on what's locally available, what was locally available at that time. And of course, the way they lived or the way they ate and whatever the primary purpose of that chair, as I said, was. Many prominent architects have designed chairs, and one has even famously said that it is more difficult to design a chair than it is to design a building. Now, what are the similarities between the two forms of architecture or design? What are the similarities between them, particularly in the case of the red-blue chair?
The chair is a very architectural chair because it's all about the load-bearing structure, which is not hidden. And because of those particular connections that Rietveld created, it almost has the appearance of an axonometric. The slats look like vectors in space that could protrude endlessly. The red-blue chair is a wonderful example of how, in the history of modernism, art, architecture, and design have always cross-pollinated each other. What can you say about the ornamentation of the chair? Say the two bird-like ornamentations are at the backrest. Was there any influence of Mughal art and architecture on the design of the chair?
So the ornamental carvings of the back of this chair, which make it quite the striking feature of it, we can see at the arcaded back there is a 6-point star, which is called the Shatcon. Now the Shatcon comprises of two triangles, an upward triangle and a downward triangle. Now this is a yantra that represents male and female principles and is a symbol of cosmic energy because of course it combines the two. We also see several forms of carving in this chair. You can see relief, etching, turning, all of this. And again, this is a very unique part of Indian furniture or furniture in India at that time, where it was combining several kinds of techniques and skill sets. On the second row, we can see 10 spindles. Now, this is again interesting to note because it is widely understood that the Indian form of design at that time was really about decoration. But I want to point out that these 10 spindles that have been arranged in the second row are actually performing a function. They're holding and reinforcing and putting the chair together. So they're really function that's doubling up as decoration. And I think that's really clever, another sort of commonality with Western design, where decoration is integrated into the function and therefore it exists, otherwise it wouldn't. In the third row, we see, of course, the jalis and the swastik shape, which has a floral and geometric pattern around it, a really beautiful combination of the two. All the frames that these details have been set into are elaborately sort of carved with floral vines. At the back, interestingly, it's been left plain. So that's interesting. It probably was used by somebody who had an audience, and therefore the front was probably seen more prominently than the back. And I think that reinforces what the use of this chair may have been. It must have been to attend to an audience, which is why they've left the back plain. Otherwise, it's unusual. Normally, even Indian jewelry, the back is always detailed.
The chair for our collection was originally purchased at an auction, and in around 2013 it was appraised by Dutch experts on restoration and Dutch furniture design, and they dated the chair on 1927, meaning that it was probably manufactured in the studio of Gerard van der Gruyne-Kahn.
You know, an interesting aspect of design in India, or sourcing design in India, is that it just is in various homes of the country. It's just hidden in the various homes. And we're really lucky that the Podar family had this chair from as far as they can remember. And I think it dates back probably to the 1900s or early 1900s. And that's how it sort of came into the map collection naturally.
And finally, a word from our patrons whose support and guidance have been integral to MAP's journey.
This is to congratulate Abhishek Podar and the entire team at MAP. What Abhishek and the team are doing is truly creditable. We continue to talk about India's rich cultural heritage, but there's still too few and too far between the quality initiatives to actually conserve, preserve and enhance this cultural heritage. Abhishek is passionate, driven and very organized about how he's setting up this first-class museum with multiple functionalities built into the initiative itself. He has not just galvanized action by himself, but he's gathered a whole lot of good wishers, well-wishers, patrons, supporters, both from within the country as also globally. I think this is a wonderful initiative and needs much more support from many of us. The arts and culture in general are an area which need attention and support from all well-thinking individuals, because this is India's true heritage, this is our soft power, and this has to be one of the wedges for growth for the future of this nation and for our connection to the world.
When he spoke to us about MAP, we thought that it was a really interesting project. His vision to preserve art for the next generation and to ensure that it is presented in an engaging form for all age groups was something that really attracted us. But even more than the vision and the scale at which he was thinking, his commitment to the project was incredible. He was willing to donate his entire collection to the museum. He was spending a lot of his personal time on this project, and that really attracted us because we knew that once he takes up something, he just does an incredible job at it. So I think his passion, his time commitment, his personal commitment to donate his own collection was something which was quite amazing. And then we saw his persistence and his ability to attract people from different backgrounds to connect with this project. So I think a lot of credible, high quality people are associated with this project who are committed to ensuring that our art gets preserved and also transferred to the next generation. I think what also impressed me was his ability to adapt the presentation to a digital format. It is not just collections, it is not just great pieces, it's not just great people, but it is also the ability to innovate and engage younger age groups. So for example, even the launch is happening in a digital way. And I think the ability to adapt and innovate to changing circumstances is also something which makes us enormously believe and happy about this project. I think if we have to preserve our culture and our traditions, art is a very important part to preserve. Art is a form of expression of society. It is a mirror of society, and we have seen that as times progressed, a lot of these forms of art disappeared. And I think this is an amazing effort to preserve, protect, and present all the art forms and photographs in a manner which will make people engage with our heritage, understand it better, and also involve younger generation